All right, so a few more details about the hormonal changes. Secretions of human chorionic gonadotropin maintains the corpus luteum, just like we said earlier. Those are produced by the trophoblasts, the outer layer of the blastocyst, that hollow ball of cells that embedded. The corpus luteum secretes estrogens and progesterone initially, and then later on, once the placenta develops, it's going to secrete much larger amounts of estrogen and progesterone. If you remember that last slide on part 2 that we looked at. Estrogen and progesterone stimulate and maintain the uterine lining, so it's going to make it thick and have enough blood flow to sustain the developing embryo and fetus. It inhibits follicle-stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. That's going to make sure that we don't go through another cycle. It inhibits uterine contractions, so we definitely don't want any cramping or contractions during this time. And it starts to enlarge the reproductive organs. So things like the uterus is obviously going to have to get larger because of the developing offspring. Relaxin is released. So anytime we got a red word, that's just a new hormone, and I would definitely know the function of each of those things. Relaxin, like the name suggests, it inhibits uterine contractions, so it tells the muscle layer to relax, and it also relaxes pelvic ligaments. The ligaments of the pelvis are going to need to be a lot more relaxed and flexible during childbirth. The entire pelvic region needs to have a lot more give to it to facilitate the birth process. Placental lactogen, so this is coming from the placenta, stimulates breast development. We'll get more into that a little bit later, but we're developing the ductile tissue, we're developing a lot of the structures that are going to allow us to produce milk after pregnancy. Or after birth. And then PTH, parathyroid hormone, if you remember that, deals with calcium. It's going to help maintain calcium concentrations in the blood. The reason behind that, I skipped aldosterone. Let's do parathyroid hormone since I've started that. The reason behind that is that we're going to need a lot of calcium to develop the embryo or the fetus, to develop the skeletal system. Calcium is going to be needed. So the mother's calcium is going to be sent to the embryo or the fetus, to the developing offspring. So parathyroid hormone is going to make sure that we have enough calcium for the mother also. So it's going to do things like increase osteoclast activity. We're going to break down bone tissue to release that calcium. Calcium is very important when you're pregnant because you're using so much for the offspring that we need to make sure we have enough for the mother also. And then aldosterone promotes sodium retention. If we keep sodium in our blood, that means that we're going to keep water too. So the reason we need that is water is lost for the because we need blood and we need a lot of fluid for the offspring. So kind of the same thing as what we just talked about with calcium. So much of that blood is going to the offspring that we need to make sure that our blood volume stays high enough. So aldosterone causes us to retain sodium, and that sodium is going to cause water retention. That's also why you'll see a lot of swelling a lot of times during pregnancy. Ankles will start to get really large and swell, and you have a lot of edema. It's just because of that elevated aldosterone means that we're keeping more sodium, which is a good thing because we need high blood volume, but that can also cause swelling. All right, so this is early embryonic stage. This is about 4 weeks after fertilization. Our embryo has started to develop. If you'll notice all of the kind of flesh-colored tan that's around this area, what that is the endometrium. This is the lining of the uterus. So our embryo has embedded into the endometrium at this point. All right, so let's look at the layers. If you'll see the green that kind of looks like fingers that are starting to branch out, that was the trophoblast is what we called it earlier. Now we're going to call it the chorion. So the chorion branches into the endometrium, and it has, those fingers are known as chorionic villi. Villi is just a finger-like projection. So each of those branches that sticks out, so like right here, you can see chorionic villi is labeled, and it's pointing to those branches that sticks out. So that's invading into the endometrium, and that's what is going to become the placenta. All right, so let's look at all of the other layers that we have right here. The amnion, at this point, it's just that little blue sac over to the right. We know later, if you've ever heard of the amniotic sac or the amniotic fluid, this is going to surround the embryo, and it is going to produce like a watery-like environment for the embryo to develop. So it's going to be surrounded in water. This gives it nutrients, it keeps it moist, keeps it from drying out, and it's also going to add a little bit of like a shock absorption if something happened to the mother and she falls or something like that. Being surrounded in water is going to be a lot more forgiving. The yolk sac. Now this sounds kind of strange because when you think yolk, you're probably thinking chicken. A lot of these embryonic layers, or actually all of them that we see in the developing human, you see in eggs, like chicken eggs. They just have different functions. So in a chicken, the yolk sac would be the food source. For us, the yolk sac is going to form the blood cells. So we know after you're born, when you are mature, your red bone marrow is where the blood cells are formed. But during embryonic development, that occurs due to the yolk sac. And then also, it's not on this picture, but there's another layer around this middle pink section right here is what's going to be the embryo. There's another layer around there called the allantois, and that also forms blood cells, and it gives rise to the umbilical arteries and veins. So that's part of the umbilical cord, has blood vessels that are inside of it, and that comes from the allantois. The connecting stalk says that will become the umbilical cord. It's got that labeled right here. So the red, the extra embryonic cavity, that's the cavity where the embryo is going to start to develop. But that red layer right there, it surrounds almost all the way around. Remember, the pink's going to be the embryo, except for that green section right there is the connecting stalk. If we could progress, if we could look forward a little bit, and we will shortly, that's going to become the umbilical cord. And then lastly, the pink section in the middle, it says those are the 3 embryonic germ layers. Or right here it says germ layers of the embryonic disc. So that kind of flat disc right there, that is actually the embryo. Believe it or not, that's out of all of those cells around there, that pink section in the middle is what's going to become the new offspring. Like we said, there are 3 layers. We have an ectoderm is the outer layer, mesoderm is the middle layer, and the endoderm is the inner layer. Okay, so we've already written these notes out, so you don't have to rewrite anything right now. But this kind of breaks down where all of those structures come from. Right now, it just looks like a blob of cells, and there's not that much going on. But this, and you do not have to know this or label it, but it points out the ectoderm becomes the skin and the central nervous system, so things like the brain and the skin are found in the ectoderm. Mesoderm was the muscles, the kidney, the heart, and you can see that right here. It points out where those things are going to come from. So the heart's developing right here early on, muscles, kidneys. And then the endoderm, it's mostly the digestive tract and the lungs. So we can see where some of those are right now too. At this point, this is an embryonic stage. We are not looking at anything that looks very human-like. But we can see where those organs are going to develop from in the future. Next few slides, we're just going to be looking at kind of pictures, so don't get hung up on any details or any notes that are written right here. But what we're looking at, if you wanted to just write for your information out to the side, picture A, this is about a 3-week embryo. So we're starting to see, in the middle section, we're starting to see segmentation of what's going to be like the spinal cord. The head region is right here. If you notice, it's got 2 hemispheres, so that's developing into like the 2 sides of the brain. And this is just a side view. Picture B, that's like 3.5 weeks, so very similar. C, you're starting to see a little bit, we can see, it doesn't, again, not very human-like looking, but this top region, let me switch over to a pen. Top region would be the head. And then down here, what kind of looks like a tail, it's actually a tail. As weird as that sounds, early on in our embryonic development, you have a tail that extends beyond like where your legs are going to develop. You actually have gills too, as weird as that sounds. The gills develop into things like your inner ear bones and parts of your jaw, so they don't stay there. Hopefully you're not born with gills and a tail. But in this very early embryonic stage, you do have those structures. So this is showing us 4 weeks to 7 weeks during embryonic development, what that looks like. It says actual length, so that's kind of tricky. What it's pointing to is this arrow right there would be actual length. But that is in your textbook. If you flip to this chapter, you can find this picture. And in the textbook, that would be the actual length. Depends on the size of the computer screen that you're looking at, how big that section is. So don't read too much into that. But we can see the tail down here. We can see the gills that are developing right around here during the 4th week. But as we progress to the 5th, 6th, and 7th week, those start to go away, and we're starting to develop into something that starts to look much more human-like. It shows you a few more changes during embryonic development. Again, do not get hung up on every single one of these notes, but it kind of shows you right around, says 35 days plus or minus 1, because there's a little bit of variation within there. So that's right around 5 weeks is when we start to see limbs, maxillary process as part of the jaw that's starting to develop, hind limbs, the back legs, and the paddle-shaped forelimbs, the arms are starting to develop. So you can go through and see those, and it kind of tells you at 56 days, plus or minus, the toes start to separate. So that would be about 8 weeks. Right, embryonic membranes. This is where we are going to start to get into the placenta. So it says, as the amnion develops, that's the fluid layer. Remember earlier it was just a small little blue section, but now that we are at this point, this is a little bit further advanced. So this is a few weeks after the last picture. The amnion, that blue fluid, completely surrounds, and we can see that this is starting to look like an embryo. We have developing eyes, arms, legs. That tail is still there. So this picture is probably closer to like I would say the 7th week. Is what we're looking at. It's not that it's important, but just so you can see that. So as the amnion develops, it surrounds the embryo all the way around, except for if you look at the umbilical cord. So here's where it's labeled, but follow that line down. You can see the amnion does not surround at this point right there. And that umbilical cord begins to form where the amnion is not located. And it forms the structures of what we call the connecting stalk. So the connecting stalk is going to be all of the structures inside the umbilical cord that are going to connect the developing embryo and later the developing fetus to the placenta, to the mother's blood source. All right? So in that umbilical cord, you can see we've got the allantois and the yolk sac that are still helping produce blood for the embryo. But we also have some blood vessels. Those blood vessels we'll look at shortly are going to be the umbilical vein and the umbilical artery. We can see, jump over here, we'll jump over to the next slide, the maternal blood vessels right here. So this is blood, wow, that's a word, blood from the mother. So this has a lot of nutrients from the food that the mother is eating. And then the blue veins, are taking away the waste. So what happens is the mother's blood is going to go to this kind of purple section that's surrounding there. That is the placenta. This is where blood from the mother is pooling. And if you'll notice, the blood vessels from the embryo are branching out and they're developing into these little stalk-like structures. It almost looks like a weird-shaped tree with all these branches that are spreading out. Now, notice that the blood from the mom and the blood from the embryo never actually touch each other, but those branches from the embryo spread out into the mother's blood source. So what happens is the nutrients and the oxygen from the mom diffuse from that pool of blood from the mother. So like right here, they diffuse from that pool of blood from the mother. And the blood doesn't move, but the nutrients and the oxygen diffuses into the fetal blood, and then that fetal blood travels to the embryonic blood travels to the embryo. Okay, I've used those terms interchangeably a lot. So embryo is what we call the developing offspring from like week 1 to week 8. And then after week 8, we call that fetal. So they're not interchangeable, but they mean the same thing. It just depends on what stage we're in. So nutrients from the mother's blood pool right here, diffuses to the embryo. And then also as waste product starts to build up in the embryonic blood, it is going to diffuse out to the mother's blood, and the mother can remove it from her functioning cardiovascular system. All right. So next topic is going to be the placenta. We'll look a lot more into that. So I'm going to go ahead and pause right now so that we'll have plenty of time to finish that up on the next part.